In the previous tutorial, we looked at how Britain prepared for the oncoming war with Germany. In this tutorial, we're going to look at what happened between September 1939 and September 1940, with particular focus, obviously, on Britain and the events in Britain between those two dates. Starting off, 1st of September 1939 was the date that Britain and France declared war on Germany after their invasion of Poland. The battle with Poland only actually lasted 4 weeks. I'm talking about the battle between Germany and Poland now. Germany against Poland lasted about 4 weeks. Germany was victorious. They destroyed the Polish army in a very short period of time. Obviously, there was no Allied support for Poland. There was no way that Britain or France could actually get soldiers or weaponry over to Poland in time for them to be able to fight the Germans with it. Poland was overrun. A big part of that was obviously the Nazi-Soviet pact, which was signed at the end of August 1939 between Soviet Russia and Germany, which allowed for Poland to be split in two. So Russia would take the east side of Poland and Germany would take the west side of Poland. So in other words, Poland was siphoned off. Now, on the 1st of September 1939, most British people, due to the warnings that had come in the 1930s about how prominent air attacks were going to be in the oncoming war, were very, very scared and wary that those air attacks would start straight away. And of course, there is the famous story that on the first day of the war, they actually tested all the air raid sirens across the country, and immediately people flung themselves under the stairs, threw themselves into cover wherever they could find it, under the bed, because they thought that's how quickly the Germans are going to attack Britain by air. But the attack never came. And we actually call this whole period between about September 1940 and September 1939 and April 1940, the phony war. A period of time where not much happened. There wasn't any direct confrontation between Germany and Britain in terms of soldiers in combat. There was naval confrontations in that period, but there wasn't any ground forces in action between Germany and Britain. People were anticipating a major war, and now questions were being asked about what kind of shape that war was going to take. Hitler, in the meantime, was consolidating his position in Poland, and he was planning his European assault. And that started in April 1940 when Hitler and the Nazis, Nazi invasion of Norway came about. So Germany invaded Norway. The British and Free French forces and the French sent troops to Norway to try and protect it from the German invasion. They were unsuccessful, and they had to actually be evacuated out of Norway back to Britain, back to the safety of Britain. It was a disaster. The Nazis were able to conquer Norway very quickly, and Norway would remain under German control all the way through to the end of World War II. And the reason why Hitler targeted Norway first was because of the natural resources, the oil, natural gas, the other resources that Norway is very rich in. That's the reason that Hitler decided to go there. And he was helped by the fact that Sweden remained neutral. Denmark allowed German troops to go through to attack Norway. So Norway fell, and after this there was a vote of no confidence in Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister. There was a vote of no confidence. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister during World War One, and a prominent member of the Houses of Parliament, made a speech where he basically laid into Chamberlain and Chamberlain's leadership. He said that Chamberlain was too weak to lead, and Lloyd George was a very good friend of Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill was put forward as the new leader to be Prime Minister. And Churchill became Prime Minister after Norway, But while this was going on, or shortly after this was going on, Germany was planning its invasion of France, and the Battle of France began in May 1940. The Battle of France began in May 1940 when German tanks broke through the Ardennes forest on the east side of France, an area that was apparently, according to the British and the French, unpassable. You couldn't actually get tanks through it. But the panzer divisions in the German army very easily and very quickly actually created roads through the forest and went through, and suddenly, once they managed to come through it, they were greeted by open fields, flat fields, easy terrain for the tanks to bomb through towards the French coast. The British and the French armies were in disarray. They retreated, and by the 26th of May, they had retreated all the way back to Dunkirk Beach, which is near Calais on the French coast, near the English Channel. There were 400,000 Allied troops on the beach in Calais and around the Dunkirk region. Many of them were actually on the beach itself, and the British had a decision to make. Ramsay, the leader of the Admiralty in Britain, who was in charge of the British Navy, said it was possible to evacuate all those British troops back to Britain. Churchill made the decision, yes, we're going to do this. It was a tough decision to make because for that evacuation to happen, they would need air cover from the RAF, so that meant Churchill knew that he would need the RAF potentially to defend Britain against Hitler. He put those squadrons into defending the evacuation areas, the port of Dunkirk and Calais. He put those squadrons into cover. The evacuation was launched. He also appealed for little ships, people who had fishing boats, pleasure steamers, anything really that could be found from Britain was going to head to the beach at Dunkirk, pick up soldiers and return them to Britain. The evacuation was described by some historians, and at the time even, as a miracle, because 330,000 British and Allied troops were evacuated from the beach at Dunkirk. So this was one of the biggest amphibious evacuations in the history of the world. And you would have to say in that respect it was a success, even though they had to leave behind them huge amounts of heavy equipment. But back home, this was actually a psychological boost. And you'll hear a lot of talk about the so-called Dunkirk spirit. The Dunkirk never give up spirit. And that really was, some people would call it a myth, because if you're evacuating a whole army off a beach, surely that's a failure. But at that stage in the war, you have to put it into context that the German war machine has been, for the last year, looks unstoppable. And in France, it has done you think about World War I, 4 years on the Western Front, moving very short distances for 4 years. The Germans had smashed through the whole of France in 4 weeks. So to manage to get these troops away, by some people, was seen as a miracle. And that's where this idea of the Dunkirk spirit came from. The problem was, at this point, France was now occupied by German troops. Back home, it was very much doom and gloom. And Churchill made his famous speech where he said the Battle of France is now over. The evacuation, by the way, ended on the 4th of June 1940, when the last British troops left France. And Churchill made his famous address where he said the Battle of France is now over, the Battle of Britain is about to begin. And 3 weeks later, he would be right, because in the interim, Hitler had planned Operation Sea Lion, which was the invasion of Britain from France using, again, landing craft with air support. The plans were put into place. The German army moved into France. They set up bases along the French coast, ready to launch this invasion. But Hitler knew that he needed air superiority to be able to launch this invasion. In other words, he needed to know that the RAF was not capable of launching attacks on German aggressors when they actually invaded Britain with Operation Sea Lion. So he was where he couldn't launch the attack at that point, which meant that he had to eliminate the RAF. Now, at this point, in the first stage of what was going to be called the Battle of Britain, and there was a few stages to it, in the first stage of the battle, Germany concentrated on destroying coastal installations and attacking shipping in the English Channel. But very quickly that moved on to attacking airfields. RAF airfields in Britain. And this tactic proved pretty successful. The airfields were situated on the south coast in Kent, on the south coast of England. They attacked them at will, and their favourite method of attack was to wait for RAF planes who were on general sorties in the air to come into land, and they would attack them as they were landing, using the sun, using the light of the sun as a method of disguise. They would attack them as they were coming into land, and they destroyed a lot of planes on the ground. Many airfield installations and defences were also destroyed. This went on pretty much to the end of August 1940, and even though Luftwaffe losses were high, RAF losses were even higher up to this point. If you think about at the start of the battle, the Luftwaffe had about 4,500 planes. The RAF had about 2,500 planes. The RAF also had very few experienced pilots left, because back here in Dunkirk, many RAF planes got shot down, and they lost a lot of their experienced pilots. So in fact, in the Battle of Britain, the average age of the British pilot was 21. And so therefore, you're talking about kids, really, up in the air, against experienced German pilots, because remember, the Germans have been building up their air force all the way through the 1930s. But nevertheless, this strategy of attacking the airfields is really proving effective. And the RAF are actually panicking by the end of August, that they can't carry on sustaining the kind of losses that they are. But then something changed. In the end of August 1940, there was a raid on Berlin by Bomber Command, where they launched a massive raid on Berlin. There was cloud cover on the day of the raid, so a lot of the bombs fell on residential areas of Berlin. Hitler was absolutely furious with this, and he actually issued a change of tactic due to this. So instead of attacking the airfields, which had been the key strategy up to that point, Hitler now decided that they would attack and bomb cities and towns in a terror campaign. The main aim was to destroy British morale, to weaken morale, and to ensure that they surrendered due to the losses of civilian life. What that meant was the RAF had not been eliminated in this phase of the battle. They'd survived. What it also meant was that by attacking the towns and cities, for example, London, Birmingham, Manchester, South Wales, etc., Cardiff, by doing that, the Me-109 aircraft that the Luftwaffe were using, the fighter aircraft that the Luftwaffe were using, had limited range. So by the time they'd actually escorted the German bombers to London, they only had about 10 minutes over London to escort those bombers, and then they would have to return. Very often they were getting to the towns and cities with no fighter escorts, which allowed the Spitfires and the Hurricanes of the RAF to attack at will, which you can see actually in this clip now, which I'm going to show you, which is on the left now as I talk, from the Battle of Britain, where you ended up with squadrons of German bombers being attacked by the big wings, as they called them, of the RAF, which was between 3 and 5 squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes that suddenly appeared out of nowhere and just basically massacred whole squadrons of German bombers. Losses for the Luftwaffe were huge between September and October 1940, but bear in mind they were launching attacks between those 2 months every single day. And of course this whole campaign was known as the Blitz, and there were various different phases to the Blitz, which we're going to look at in the following tutorial. We're also going to discuss evacuation, which had started actually in September 1939, because coming off there, we've obviously got the evacuation of civilians. But essentially, just looking at it for now from a military point of view, the RAF had survived. They could now attack Luftwaffe bombers, and by October, the amount of raids went down by the Germans, and Hitler temporarily suspended Operation Sea Lion. In other words, the Battle of Britain was a victory for Britain and its allies. And when we talk about its allies, we talk about the Czech and Polish fighter squadrons who played a massive part in that battle. In fact, the 303rd Polish Squadron was had one of the highest kill rates in the whole of the RAF during the Battle of Britain. So it was not just a British thing. There was contributions from occupied countries, and also volunteer pilots who came from as far and wide as the United States and South Africa and New Zealand, who came to literally volunteer their services as pilots during the battle. It was the first setback really for Germany during World War II. I don't know if you call Dunkirk a setback, but certainly the Battle of Britain was a setback. They had failed to destroy the RAF. The invasion was suspended, and when we move on, we'll see that it was never put into operation again due to the Germans invading Russia in the summer of 1941.